Today's Research Day, 2023, April 6th. And we're here to present some preliminary results from the Indigenous Community Justice Knowledge Project. And so I'm going to let the students in the Applied Anthropology class who are doing a lot of the work and analyzing all of the work and analyzing the transcripts that have come from the project. I'm going to let them introduce the project, talk about its methods, share some of their results, and then we'll talk about next steps and things like that. So I will step back for purposes of posterity. I'm Mike Kimball, Professor of Anthropology here at University of Northern Colorado, and these are the students in my Applied Anthropology Methods class. So I will step back and invite, I think it's Nick, who's going to go first.
Good morning. My name is Nick. So in today's presentation, we're going to break down what we're all kind of looking at as a living project. Globalization, COVID-19, colonialism, oppression, and climate change have threatened a lot of intangible heritage of Indigenous communities across the globe. The Indigenous Community Justice Knowledge Project hopes to preserve the oral traditions and knowledge held by those communities. For some background, the night before classes started, Professor Kimball just got back from India after spending part of his winter break to meet with project partners, including international filmmaker Dakxin, Chhara, Bhasha Research and Publication Center, and then to interview our community-based researchers and visit some of the interview sites. His work in India established relationship with the panchayats, village councils, of the Chhara and Rathwa tribes. Dakxin, his team, and members of the Chhara and Rathwa tribes spent hours conducting interviews and hours translating and assembling the transcripts that they eventually sent to us. The two tribes interviewed were the urban Chhara, who are a denotified nomadic tribe, and the rural Rathwa, who lived in and continue to live in small villages. Professor Kimball and our partners put together the means to document oral knowledge with participatory ethnographic evaluations and the development of a remote training curriculum so that our community-based researchers have a uniform interview guide, as well as the project aims, methods, and IRB protocol. With everything in place, the interviews were commenced, translations were made, and transcripts were and continue to be delivered, and we as a class have begun to analyze the Indigenous community knowledge through the use of coding in vivo. Now, what is the ICJK? The ICJK, or the Indigenous Community Justice Knowledge, is the heart of the project. ICJ, or Indigenous Community Justice, is a form of customary laws that arise from orally transmitted knowledge, experience, and traditional practices used to resolve disputes and protect assets, and is a form of intangible heritage. The ICJK project itself is a way to record, analyze, and preserve this knowledge, as Indigenous community justice is an important part in heritage management and preservation, as customary law can be found at the center of legal pluralism, or how the relationship between customary law and state-level legal systems can be identified and explained. The ICJK project hopes that recording and preserving this normally orally transmitted knowledge will help in cultural survival of Indigenous peoples and cultures. So what is our research question? Our research question is, what is the content of Indigenous community justice knowledge, and how have Indigenous communities applied and adapted this knowledge in an ever-changing world?
So as the students participating in this project, our first methods was pretty much receiving these transcripts provided to us by our professors and coding them individually and collaboratively in vivo. So this process included us teaming up with teams of two. Each team assigned a transcript. We would collaborate individually, and then we'd come together to discuss and negotiate these codes in class. Revising the codes based on team decisions and class discussions were always a factor in meeting within the classroom. Collaboratively, our transcripts were getting a little complicated to comprehend as to one. For writing our code book, Determining the codebook for our collective transcript went about us doing class discussions and again, combining these codes and creating and or deleting things that didn't necessarily fit into these transcripts. We were checking discrepancy within codebooks and making revisions as a class as we went to further combine these transcripts in the right way. An example of this codebook would look similar to this next slide here. This is an example of our master codebook. So this is the final codebook that we have a part of. An example of this being a parent and a child code. I'll explain that real quick. In these transcripts, they talked about a lot of things. So you had to categorize these things as maybe many things or some things. An example of this could be within the transcripts, it can talk about property or land or brothers. If all of those things were in the same sentence, you would code them under property land, but also probably family brother, since it mentions both of them. And that's where it got a little complicated with trying to figure out everybody's situation within their transcripts.
And here is going to be a brief video example of one of the meetings conducted by our community-based researchers in the village Kakakun.
રિવાજોના ને કાયદાઓના ન્યાયના જે ચાલે છે એના વિશે અમે ડોક્યુમેન્ટ કરવાના છે અમારા પંચને સંમતિથી આ ડોક્યુમેન્ટ કરવા માટે ભેગા થયા છે બધા સંમતિથી ભેગા થયા સામાજિક કામ માટે હું 1984 જોડાયેલો એમાં કુટુંબના બધા છે ને પંચમ જોડાયેલી લગ્નમાં લગ્ન ગોઠવાના હોય ને એટલે અમારા તો ગામના તો ફળિયાના છે બધા આગેવાનો આનંદના આગેવાનો હોય તો પૂંજાર હોય પટેલ હોય એ લોકો વ્યવસ્થા કરી હું લગભગ 1995 થી સામાજિક કાર્યક્રમમાં જોડાયેલો છું અભ્યાસ ચાલુ હતો તો પણ અમારા સમાજના નાના નાના.
So my name is Blake Moore. We're the first research team. So one thing I want to point out before we get started is that both communities were interviewed in very different ways. And so the Rathwa were interviewed about their actual processes for the punch. And then the Chhara were asked mostly about the stories. So you'll probably see a lot of that throughout the different groups. And the Rathwa communities in the transcripts detailed that they listen to both sides to determine who's at fault for issues. And then they share their opinions within the punch and decide where to go from there, and then share their conclusions. And their main goal is to avoid going to courts so that they don't, so that families don't go bankrupt and lose food and their salaries trying to afford court costs. And the Chhara communities would rely on storytelling to solve disputes, and they would listen to both sides just like the Rathwa would. And then the leaders of the punch would read religious stories so that they could relay and relate it to the conflicts that arise that are brought up to the punch.
Hello, I am Allison. And I'm Jessica. And this was my research that we did.
So the first, I don't know if I'm blocking it, but okay, cool. So the first one was that how important and meaningful storytelling is and was to both Rathwa and the Chhara communities. So one of our favorite stories is the story of the crow, and it's about a crow who is sitting on a tree and he begins to cry because he's upset and he's angry that he was born a crow and that he has black feathers and he'd much rather have white feathers. And then a saint is sitting below the tree and overhears him and says, I can grant your wish, but you should talk to the swan first. So the crow then talks to the swan and says how lucky they are. But the swan says that they are not lucky because they have, even though they have these white feathers, they never have any privacy. No one ever leaves them alone. So then the crow says, I'd rather be a parrot. And then talks to the parrot, and the parrot says, no, I'm not lucky because I'm green and the leaves are green. So no one ever knows that I'm here. And then the crow says, well, then I'd rather be a peacock. And then flies to the peacock and tells him how lucky he is. But then the peacock says, I'm not lucky because my beautiful feathers are often the cause of my death, right? Or like peacock's death, not like it's because he's alive. But so then the crow flies back to the same and says, I'm happy being a crow. I'm happy with my black feathers. And the moral of the story is that we should be happy with what we're born with because we were all made in like the perfect way and the specific way.
So the next point that we found is they have a very good relationship with the justice system. They're very close and tied with the court system and the police system. The police system actually helped them out. And if someone goes to the police with an issue, they actually will recommend them to go to the paunch instead. The paunch is used as a much more accessible resource to the people. It's usually cheaper, it's easier, and there's less interactions and paperwork, and you don't have to do all these files and everything like that. So a lot of people actually prefer to go to the paunch for these problems to be solved instead of the police, and the police seem to prefer it as well since they will refer people to go to the paunch. Jessica?
And then we did notice, like within the transcripts, there are a few limitations. So the Chhara and Rothwell communities, like rely on the project to diffuse almost all issues. They don't like solve and like every single issue. And some of these include like huge like investigative felonies, and if there was like a lot of violence within like a specific issue, so those are more left to the police and everything.
All right, well, hi, everyone. My name is Anita Patain, and
Zygmunt Darshowski.
and we're part of just research team 3. And what we started to do was to identify the different bodies that existed within the paunch. So between the paunch and the Chhara, they have vastly different ways of dealing with things. And the paunch had the majority of entering the relations with between the other villages and their state government. So they helped mediated the disputes and distribution of property.
And then there's various other kind of administrative functions that the paunch takes on as well. So it's not, as was just indicated, it's not just a judicial body. And so there is that mediation of disputes, and then entering into relations, and then arranging and kind of organizing and informing the community about different celebrations or religious holidays and when they'll be held. So there's what we ultimately found is that there's kind of only a limited application of our kind of Western conception of government as like the tripartite model with a judicial and legislative and executive branch that are all kind of distinct and almost in conflict with one another in order to, ensure balance. Instead, they all kind of come together into this one council body. And when actually doing justice, as was previously indicated by Anita and Dr. Kimball as well. There's a restorative justice aspect very strongly, and it's not necessarily something that excludes punitive justice, but rather, as opposed to the Indian government's way of executing justice,
instead of just punishing you for, say, stealing something, the paunch will go through a couple of processes before forcing like a fine or whatever upon somebody. So they'll try and go to the person and explain what it was about what they did that's wrong. And they do request that there's some sort of restitution, but ultimately the goal is to get the individual who committed the crime to be kind of the active participant in that restorative justice, to give restitution of their own choice. So we additionally had some interesting findings regarding the nature of these two communities as oral communities. There were significant mentions in the transcripts we analyzed of different ideas of, for example, this Kali Kitab, which was a Chhara concept, and it translates to black book. And the idea is basically that you've got black text on a black page, and therefore it's unreadable in physical form. So it's something that is just known by the community rather than being something that's written down and referenced like a document. And then the Ratwa as well indicated that they prefer to keep all their records and proceedings as oral procedures rather than writing them down. And they did indicate that they do write things down and record their processes on certain occasions, but it was primarily with those cases that were of a grave concern. So if, say, somebody killed somebody, then it would be something that they kind of have to, in part at least, go through those kind of Indian state procedures on, rather than the oral, solely community visions. And so this brought up the question of, given that they are both primarily oral cultures, and that storytelling features heavily in most of the methods of conflict resolution, essentially we wondered, is there a difference in how we distinguish in the West the categories of stories that are operating as sort of religious stories versus those operating as just historical record, versus those operating more as, say, a fable or a parable, or that kind of moral fiction that's intended to indicate how you should live. And so as a potential area for future research, we determined that it's a worthwhile investigation, and we could conduct future interviews that focused more heavily on these stories, probably along the lines of the interviews conducted with the Chhara, that were more focused on specific stories of the conflict resolution, or stories that were told in order to resolve conflicts. And this would involve a compilation of these stories and kind of analysis and categorization into our more of like a Western classification. And then following that, kind of analyzing them and seeing whether distinctions are made between certain categories that we would establish in the West, or the differences in how those stories are told depending on the category, things like that.
Hi, I'm Emily Rego, and I'm part of research team 4. And both of our transcripts are about the Chhara paunch system. And two things that we really noticed were that both transcripts give examples of storytelling that is used to solve conflict and resolve disputes. And also another thing that we noticed was the transcripts discuss the paunch structure and how they do things within meetings. And a big thing that stood out to me was that they sit in a circle or a round form when they do meetings, and they do this because they want to be able to see everyone's faces that are there during the meeting, and it's easier to tell like how people are talking and their body language and how they're speaking and their what's the word? Facial expression, sorry. Also the paunch are there to help the community diffuse issues and pass on laws and traditions from the past to people who are in the community now. And also something that was kind of unique about ours was we only heard from one paunch member from both transcripts, so we're only hearing from his side and his perspectives, which we'll get into with the limitations during the transcripts. So these are his opinions and how he sees things, but other people in the community could think other things throughout their time.
So I'm Brianna. And this is
I'm
Nick.
Nick again.
And we're part of Research Team 5. So one of the big things that we noticed in our transcripts is that the Chhara typically used the paunch as a source of advice and conflict management, whereas the Ratha used it more of like mediation of conflicts, which was interesting.
Another big thing is with both the Rothwell and the Chhara was this idea of how things look now and how things used to look in the past. And that's respect for the paunch's rulings, respect for the paunch in general, whether or not it was an effective method or if people still thought of it as an effective method. So there was a lot of conflict between the past and the present on how the community handles this group of individuals and their form of community justice and legal.
So one of the functions within the in vivo qualitative data analysis software that the class is trained in is our ability to run queries and run matrix on data. And so this right here is just a really preliminary of what the work that the students have done so far. So this is going to show data cross-referencing between tribes, so we can kind of do a comparison between the Chhara and the Ratwa. And on the side, you'll see some of the codes that the students have selected as being prominent in the transcripts. So, you know, we can kind of see where instances are lining up. So the idea of paunch versus courts, as Nick had just mentioned, is prevalent in both, where it seems important that they're talking about the difference between the community's use of the paunch and then the community's use of the court system and just kind of the difference between the two. Another thing that we can see here is, for instance, some belongings. So property, different instance of property. So house, land, money, and just kind of how that differs, how each of those kind of show up between the two. Like, for instance, in the Ratwa tribe, we have 0 instances of the property of housing listed, but 4 instances of it in the Chhara, and just kind of how some of these differ. And then also notable too, the idea of the use of police, so going outwards and seeking help from the police versus the paunch as well.
Right, so what you see here are just preliminary results. This is a lot of work that the students been putting into just basically importing these transcripts, learning how to analyze them using the software, discovering themes that are kind of hidden inside sometimes what people are saying. And another piece of it that we haven't mentioned is just the disconnect, and this might come up in the limitations, of course, but the disconnect between our understanding of a culture and their own understanding of it, and how do we parse that that difference. And so part of the project also is connecting with our partners in ways that help us elucidate some of the things that we're not so sure about. So, for example, students, in addition to doing these kinds of analyses and identifying codes and relationships, are also noting questions that they have or terms that they're coming across that aren't making sense to them. And then we bring those back to the partners and have them help us understand. So we have a meeting coming up soon in which we're doing that. So the project continues in that way. And as Nick mentioned at the very beginning, we have new data coming in also to be analyzed over the course of the rest of the semester. And so we're excited to see if we can find if the patterns we're noticing are holding up and what kinds of new variations are showing up as well. So I think the next step is just talk a little bit about the limitations, correct? Okay.
Hello, I'm Allison again. Okay, so these are the limitations that we found within our research. The first one is a huge language barrier. We're taking their transcripts from their natural dialect into Hindi, and then into English. So it's 3 times translated, and because of that, things could easily get lost in translation. What they're saying might not be what we're actually hearing, and so it's our job as a class to make sure that what they're telling us is correct and that we're able to understand them even if we're not speaking the same language. And it's just a little bit of a challenge for us to go through these just because we're not speaking the same language and we might not be getting the full picture because of that. Going into that, they are from a completely different culture. They are in India, we are in America. Things are very, very different. And so we might also have a hard time understanding where they're coming from. And it's our job as an anthropology class to apply ethical considerations when talking to them and when we're researching them, because what they think might be normal, we might think to be very different. And so it's our job to respect them and to understand them to the best of our ability, even if we can't. And like Dr. Kimball said, we would be meeting with them in the future. So hopefully this will change and hopefully we can break down that cultural barrier. And then we also have a small sample size. Like mentioned earlier, we only have access to these transcripts and we only have access to these 2 communities and a handful of people within those communities. This kind of goes into the 4th point. We don't have everybody's voices in this. We have a very, very small collective and we don't know what everybody's saying and we don't really have access to that. Hopefully in the future, we'll get more transcripts and we'll get more of an ability to have more voices heard. And that, like I said, goes into the 4th point. We don't have everybody's voices, especially women. We've only interviewed a handful of people, and most of those people, actually all of them, were men. So we don't have women voices or other people in the community, and that's just a little limitation that we kind of have to consider because it might alter our conclusion and what we have found.
So bearing these limitations in mind, some of our next steps are to code the transcripts that we're receiving. And then we're going to present our research at the High Plains Society for Applied Anthropology Conference. And then once that's all done, we're planning to upload the data into a database for use for future research.
So I want to thank lots of folks, especially the students here in this room today who have put in so much time and struggled to make things work and succeeded in doing that and found some really interesting results and created the beginnings of a very exciting project, which we hope to continue. Our partners are working with me on putting together a grant grant proposal to the National Geographic Society in the hopes of getting funding to continue the project and grow it in some new and interesting ways to maybe address some of those limitations, like what Allison mentioned, bringing other voices in. So that would be women who are part of panchayats in other parts of Gujarat, also voices from community members who are not part of the panchayat, which includes young people who can probably shed some light on, why there is some, in some villages anyway, some communities, some tension around the role of the panchayat, its traditional role versus the society people are living in today. So lots of really interesting areas to explore, including bringing, as we heard also in the presentation, more stories into it so that we can understand how it connects up to their understanding of the world and their traditions and the origins of the panchayat itself. So super excited about that. So again, want to thank the students for all of their effort in putting this work together. Also want to thank, of course, our project partners, without whom, obviously, we wouldn't be standing here today sharing results with anyone. So they are incredible people and organizations. Bhasha Research and Publication Center has been around for a very long time, doing incredible work across India, working with Adivasi communities, and Dakxin, Chhara, and Budan Theater, which is an effort in the Chhara community to raise awareness of their story, their heritage, and the injustices committed against the Chhara people through the Criminal Tribes Act, and continued stigmatization. The work they do is incredibly creative and very far-reaching with the production of documentaries and all sorts of other kinds of art forms, including theater. So I'm super grateful to them, and also to the Provost Seat Grant, which funded this project and allowed us to get the ball rolling, and hopefully to bring in more funding in the future to continue the project.